Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. Today on the Writer's Gym, I'm joined by Alex Dahl. Alex is a half Norwegian, half American author. She studied Russian, German and international studies in Oslo and Moscow before pursuing an MA in creative writing at Bath Spa University at the same time as me, what we have horrifically realised was about 20 years ago. She has been a full-time novelist since 2017 and is the author of 6 psychological thrillers. She's published by, among others, Penguin Random House USA, head of Zeus UK, Harper Collins Australia, as well as translated into 16 foreign languages, and her debut novel, The Boy at the Door, was shortlisted for a CWA Dagger Award. Her third novel, Playdate, was adapted for the screen by Bright Star and Key Street Productions, and is currently streaming on Disney Plus worldwide as TV series The Stolen Girl. Alex's first novel, The Boy at the Door, is also in production for the screen with Paragon France, and Alex is executive producer for both shows. Her latest novel, Girlfriends, set in London and Ibiza, was published in 2024. Alex loves to travel and has lived in Norway, Spain, France, the UK, Switzerland and Germany. One of the things that made me so happy about speaking to Alex is how she shares what has been so important to me, and I know is so important to many of the Writer's Gym, is working out what you want and that you have the right to want it. That being a writer and being curious about the stories that are already in you is a lot about how you get those stories out and committing to that curiosity. How you make the space in your life, how you make the time in your life begins with how you think about yourself and that career. So the creative writing exercises and the creative confidence exercises that bring you into that state are so important. And it was just such a delight to speak to Alex again. I hope you enjoy this as much as I have. It is so lovely to see you, Alex. It has been, oh my God, most of my life.
Gee, I mean, I think I was thinking about this. I think it's been 20 years.
It's terrifying, isn't it?
It is really quite terrifying. Yeah.
That's almost as long as I'd been alive when we did the MA.
I know, exactly. It's insane. But I try not to think about it. I'm like, oh, it was pretty recently.
It feels very, very recent, as does, in some ways. Let's just go back chronologically to,
yeah.
My God, half our lives ago that could have been yesterday.
Yes.
And I mean, you'd already done some very, very impressive stuff and multilingual and oh my God, so much. But when you were starting the MA and when we met, did you see the career that you've got into coming? Was that what you wanted or thought about?
Yes, to be honest, like I did have inflated ambitions even back then, maybe more so than now, I think. I did dream of the kind of stuff that I'm doing now, to be honest. But, like if dreaming doesn't make it happen. And I was very sort of, okay, how can I go from here to, it was especially the filming stuff that I really, really wanted at some point, but it took a while.
Maybe we'll just put chronology in the bin then, because the newer stuff and what's happening now, would you like to start by talking about that?
Sure. I mean, so my third novel, Playdate, was optioned for a TV series in 2020, and it was in the middle of the pandemic, and I was literally sitting in this tiny basement office in Norway in lockdown and working on the next book when this happened, and it just felt so far removed from my life at the time. It was hopeful that it would actually get made, but you just never know in the early stages of development, and the production teams that bought it were really, really fantastic, and I was so excited to work with them. And it took about 3 years of development before the green light, and then they started shooting in 2023, and now it is out streaming on Disney Plus, which is obviously very exciting, but also kind of surreal and super exciting. So that's the forefront of my sort of career mind at the moment, for sure.
And did you take the sort of Leon Moriarty, once there's a production company, it's sort of in their hands, it's their baby, or were you more involved with their things that it was important to you to keep the same? What was that like?
I was executive producer on the show and quite involved at the development stage, but not on script level. And I did feel really quite strongly that after they optioned it and went into production, that they should have the freedom to adapt it as they wanted to, without, me being controlling in terms of staying very close to the novel. And I think that's important that they have that creative freedom, because it is a different realm. And I didn't have the experience with adaptation to be in a position to tell them how to do it. And I think they've done a really fantastic job. So I never felt like that need for controlling that process.
So, because, forgive me, not familiar with how it would work, as executive producer, do you choose who adapts, and then is that a key relationship?
It was a conversation, and I was involved in, on the episode level as we went along and looking through the scripts and all of that stuff, but not on like detailed level, no.
And then you stay in touch with them, and you're in charge of the arc, is that right?
Yeah, I think it depends on every project. I saw myself more as a sort of consultant, so if there was something they wanted, especially from like a creative point of view in terms of the characters and stuff like that.
So it is that sort of thing that they now. I'm not saying passing on the baby, because it's a different creature, isn't it?
Yeah,
and you're there to help when they want you to help, but you also get the magic of seeing other people doing it. Like, I guess I do find that quite fascinating, because with writing, there is the point where you've written the book and the book is in the hands of the reader, and we know that that then they've got their own world, and it's sort of like being able to see what a reader's picture of that book looks like.
Yeah, and like having that distance in a way to your creative project I think that's something that maybe comes about with experience as well. I didn't feel like that at the beginning of my career. When we were doing the MA, I wanted to control how the reader perceived what I wrote in a sense, but you realize that you can't do that, and it has to speak for itself once it leaves your hands.
That control aspect, and I think I recognise that feeling, and I don't want to sort of project onto it, but the criticism, among the many criticisms that I received, was that you're too chummy with your characters and you need to be able to let the terrible things happen to them. Now, that does not strike me as a problem for you, because Nordic noir does rather revolve around that. What was the control for you?
Maybe more like addressing that relationship between showing and telling, that I would perhaps feel very inclined to just tell the reader what they should think about the characters, rather than trusting that by showing them that they will draw their own conclusions and build their own images, so that it's not my role to try to control what those images are, not the author's role.
Yeah. Wind it up and let it walk. Something that you do brilliantly that remains quite difficult for me is, I'm not sure I experience the way that people talk about, are you a plotter or a pantser, like it's that simple. For me, I'm very character driven. I get where my stories come from is very much, who is this person, what's going on for them, what do they need to know about the world, and how is this going to teach it to them. I was less plot driven, but I think having what you're describing, where you are maybe instinctively telling the reader that little bit more what to think. The sort of the strength and weakness that kind of maybe goes with that is that there is more of a drive to it. There is more of a, this is what happens, moving the story forward. I'm just wondering, was that maybe more of an instinctive or more of an enjoyable thing for you?
Yeah, I think like you, I am quite character driven. Like, most of a novel springs from understanding the characters, and much of my pre-work is in that rather than on the plot side of things. And then I kind of park them for a bit and work on the plot structures. But I know my characters pretty well before I put them on stage, so to speak, in the sense that I have to understand their motivations and like what drives them and what do they want. That's something I always ask myself. And it's actually something that I've started to apply to real life. It's like, in interactions with people, like characters, it's super enlightening to just bring it back down to like, what does this person actually want? What is their desired outcome in whichever relationship, whether it's a child or a partner or just a random stranger? It's the same with characters. It's like, what is it that drives them in this particular interaction? And that's so useful for me in novel writing, because it really does inform so much of the interpersonal relationships and also how to structure the plot, because you can always bring it back to that and be like, okay, so I'm stuck here. But in this particular moment, what is the pressing point for this character? What do they want? What are they willing to do to get it? Do you know what I mean? So I think about that kind of thing a lot. So they tie in, but yeah.
I cannot tell you how happy I am to hear you say that, because from the writing coaching point of view, one of the things I hear myself coming back to a lot when I'm working with clients is we do need to know what our characters want, and we do need to be okay with the fact that we want things. And socially and historically, I think for women particularly, the idea of I want, and I had a beloved teacher who would say to me that the thing that she'd learned from her adults was I want, don't get. You know, just in terms of careers and art and it being okay to create. Not only does it make it easier to gain that creative confidence and to focus on what you actually want to create, but in doing so, in showing yourself that that is okay, it opens up so much about you, and it opens up so much of your writing world. It is really lovely to hear you saying that.
Yeah, and I think it's true, especially the context of women historically too. Like we have been so conditioned to not want, or when we do want something, that it's just not necessarily tolerated, and I think that does seep into the creative anything really in life, right? Including creation of any kind.
I am going to go back in time again, if that is okay, we graduated in 2007, so it would have been academic year. It was something a bit silly, wasn't it? Because there was a big jump between finishing and graduation, so it was like 5 to 6. And what was useful to you about that, and what came later in terms of looking back at what you learned? If there are people out there sort of early on, what's it been like for you?
I have reflected a lot about that, and people do ask me quite often, do I need an MA in creative writing, or should I get one, or would you be where you are if you hadn't done it? And it's obviously impossible to answer in that sense, but for me, ultimately it was very useful. Also from a cultural perspective and from an industry perspective, I grew up in Scandinavia, mostly in Norway, in a very A4 environment, super safe and lovely. However, not especially focused on creative arts in my environment. And when I first came to Bath to do the MA, it was actually the first time that I was surrounded by other writers. And I hadn't grasped the fact that there were actually other people like me, so it was that initial meeting of finding your people. And that's so powerful, especially when you're very young, right? And I just thought there was something perhaps wrong with me or whatever, because I knew that I had to write. I've always known it. And my grandmother was actually a novelist and my father was a writer. So in my family setting, I was surrounded by creative people and very much encouraged to pursue a career as a writer. But I knew I'd have to leave Norway and to, do things that nobody around me were doing. So from that perspective, especially for me personally, it was very useful. And also in terms of just understanding how the industry works in the UK, how to get an agent, all of those things. But so many of those things are things that we, of course, get from other sources. But at the time, for me, it was useful.
And it's sort of being ready as well, isn't it? That when you meet lots of people, you see other people doing these things, realise it's just humans doing their best. And I guess it makes you clearer about what you're looking for. Did you meet your agent that year, or was it a different time?
No, it came years later. I actually had my son straight after the MA, like literally 2 weeks after handing in my final draft of the novel, very pregnant. So I took a lot of time off to be with him. And then I had my daughter a couple of years later. So I actually had a big lull between the MA and actually writing full time. And I think having the children too was something that really pushed me more towards pursuing a career as a writer, because it suddenly seemed very unreachable in a way that it hadn't done when I was on the MA, because then I was surrounded by other writers and everyone was talking about, how to write a novel, how to get published, how to get an agent. And suddenly I was in this storm of small children for years. And I just thought, you're going to have to get a lot more serious to actually be able to do this. And so it sharpened my focus very significantly. But it was hard in that sense.
That you've got to get serious and sharpening your focus. What did that look like for you?
It looked like starting to build habits and not sit around at home dreaming about it, and starting to, even if it was a case of 300 words a day, but actually just getting the time in. So I became very strict with myself and with my surroundings and by getting that time. So at the beginning, it really was like a couple of hundred words a day. But I built a lot of experience in that time and wrote a couple of novels that ended up in a drawer. But it's building experience. Published a couple of short stories, that kind of thing. My first novel in Norwegian was published in 2013. But I wrote that book in English and translated it, and then it got picked up in Norway kind of randomly.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I knew that, okay, I really, really want to work in the UK, worldwide, really. I did in English. And so, yeah, I wrote and wrote and wrote. And there's no other way to do it, right? You just have to build your experience. And I tell people this all the time who tell me they want to write. They say, I've written a novel and I've sent it to 20 agents, but haven't heard back. And my question is usually, in the nicest possible way, okay, but what are you doing to build more experience in the meantime? And like, keep writing. You don't stop writing at that point where you have one manuscript. It's great. It's amazing to have completed a draft of a novel. You have to keep writing. It doesn't end there.
And this is something that does really strike me about what you're talking about with it as a career, is recognizing that the world isn't psychic, that you need to go out there and you need to find your people and you need to do the things that you need to do. At the Writers' Gym, we do a lot of creative writing exercises. The reason I qualified as a coach was because I need writers to have that completely safe environment, to not have that massive great wall between here is my writing life, here is my emotional and actual life. You need to be able to float freely to wherever you need to be in that moment. So one of the things that I do is creative confidence building exercises about life, about going out there and doing it. Is there maybe a thought you have when you're approaching people or when you're sort of auditioning people for, are you my people? Are you somebody that I want to connect with? What happens like in your head?
In terms of, do you mean in terms of other writers or more like industry contacts or just in life? Or
I think depending on where we are, it's kind of the same thing up to a point, isn't it? That you're trying to meet people who are fellow journeyers to move yourself and your project forward. So maybe it's different, maybe it's the same.
Yeah, I think there are commonalities across those things, really. I would say for me personally, I'm very instinctive about that. And also as a person and as a writer. But that's taken me a really long time to learn to trust my gut instinct about people, about the direction of travel in terms of the creative process. First of all, I think it is really important to have community and to have other people who get what you're doing, because whatever you're trying to create from a writer's perspective, I think writers need other writers, because it's a way of being. It's not just something you do, it's something that you are. And so to get out there, however you do that, whether it's joining a writers group, which for me personally has been hugely helpful off the back of the MA. I have 2 that I meet with quite frequently, and just having that community of other people who get what you do, it's a huge thing, because it's quite far removed from a lot of people's day-to-day lives. So it's hard to relate to.
It is hard to relate to, which brings us to the sort of the art life, as my beloved David Lynch has it, in terms of making time to write, because you mentioned that was what get serious, get the habits going, and having that conversation with yourself. So in terms of your relationship with your own time, with the people and other things in your life, I get the feeling you are good at being strict with yourself. I don't know if that took time, but what are the parameters for you?
To be honest, that has been a struggle always. And I think that's like with any other job, as you know, a lot of my friends who are not writers relate to this, and especially in terms of having family and a young family and combining that with work, it's hard. It takes a lot of organizing, a lot of compromise. I think the hardest thing in my case has been that it has involved a lot of international travel in the last 7 years. On the one side, it's like hugely fun to have the opportunities to go somewhere and talk to readers about your work and to connect with other writers, but it's also hard to leave the people at home. And it's a big ask for the people around you sometimes. To be honest, I have probably made my career a very, very strong priority. I've turned down a lot of things in my personal life. There have been football matches that I've missed, for sure, quite a few, which looking back, sometimes I'm like, was it worth it to place my career so at the forefront? I mean, that's not to say I haven't also done that with my kids, but finding the balance has been hard. It is hard. And it's an ongoing thing. I think at this point, I have a more reflected relationship with it, because I've done a lot of the things that I wanted and needed to do. with my work. That's not to say I don't have other things that I want to do with it, but I don't have that that same hunger for it that I had 10 years ago. That was almost like a desperation. Like I had to write that book that would be a game changer. And it was like the only thing I thought about. Professionally, it was almost like an obsession. And the advantage with that is that it gives you a very, very strong drive. And I do now struggle to reconnect with that kind of drive.
Yeah, it's something that I admire enormously, because I did not have that clarity in my 20s of, among many other things, I didn't get that I had the right to this. I didn't get that it wasn't about sort of looking for other people's approval first. It was finding your own world. So the phrase I use a lot is aim to be interested, not interesting. That it's about finding your focus on it, not what does somebody else think, am I interesting enough? I did not get that memo in my 20s. I feel like it is where I am now, and I'm happy I've done useful things, stuff like that. But I'm now acknowledging that I did 2 short story collections, because I was writing a novel. I was in an anthology, got offered a short story collection, went ooh shiny, ran off in that direction, got another one, stayed running off going ooh shiny. And now coming back to what I was doing. And there is a lot of fear in that. But the thing that I sort of feel I understand now that maybe I didn't before is the joy in it. That it's not a case of I'm late, that other people did this then. It's a case of everybody's voice is completely unique. Everybody is on their own journey. And new things do come along, don't they? That there are eras for things, and you have achieved things that 20-something-year-old you knew she wanted, understood she had to be the one to make happen, I think. And then something else maybe happens next.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're absolutely right. There's a time for everything, and nobody's trajectory is the same as somebody else's, which is that whole thing back to comparison in general, right? It's just not helpful. Sometimes it's impossible to not look at somebody else's trajectory on Instagram or at a book fair or whatever, or just, in your friendship group and not make comparisons. But I think of it as that butterfly effect thing too. Like if I hadn't done this one little thing, then none of these things would have happened. And it's the same for everybody else. So it's not a case of, oh, if I hadn't made that choice instead of that one, my life would be completely different. We don't know, because all of those little decisions change everything.
I'm going to ask you something really random just because it's on my mind. In Girlfriends, I read at the end of it that you named Bianca and Charlotte after your friends. I would love to know, were you seeing those faces? Because the thing with me in names is once I have a name in my head, I'm going to be seeing that person. Was it different for you? Did the names come later? Or could you see your friends?
It's something that I actually discussed quite extensively with those 2 friends. Because I said, if we do this and I go with these names, people might think it's you, first of all. Second, it's like sometimes I might find it hard to separate like the real person from the character, but actually it wasn't a problem. And the reason it happened like that was that Charlotte, who's one of the main characters, for some reason she was just always Charlotte in my head, and that's quite often the case with characters. I just have a name and that's that. And then the second person, I was like, I don't know, I want a name that's international but also slightly more unusual. And Charlotte and Bianca, my friends, are very close friends in real life, and I was discussing this with Bianca, and she's like, why don't you call her Bianca? And I was like, would you let me do that? She's really quite something. And Bianca was like, yeah. And I was like, and she spells her name with a K. So I was like, do you want me to spell it with a C to make a bit of a differentiation? And she's like, no. I want it with a K. So I was like, all right, well, I'm going to take you for an actual crazy ride. And she's like, yeah, bring it on. They were both very, very cool about this naming situation, but it's very much fiction. That being said, sometimes, I would call on the dynamics of female friendship is very central to the novel in itself, and not just with those particular friends, but with all of my friends. So, I do call on, things in my personal sphere, but I managed, it was actually quite easy to separate the characters from the people once they were doing what they had to do in the novel, plot-wise.
Yeah. I was thinking, Maggie O'Farrell talks about how she couldn't have written Hamnet until her son was older than Shakespeare's son was when he died, because she just couldn't bear that. And I both admire and am fascinated by, because I can be quite superstitious about things. I catch myself doing that. And to deal with children going missing and to deal with, friendship, things like that. Does any of that ever happen for you? Because my partner would argue that my sense of what is literally real and not, is I'm a storyteller. I work in stories. We have a bagpuss who is deeply real to me. It's all fiction and life. Is it like that for you? Is that a thing that goes through your head?
Yes, it is. And it's, the thing that Maggie O'Farrell said, that really stuck with me also when I read the book and I read her, I think it was it in the afterword? I think maybe.
I've heard her interviewed quite a few times, and I can't picture it in the afterword, but I'm pretty sure it is.
No, maybe it was in an interview. But I do remember hearing or reading that exact quote and thinking that would be very true for me too. That, it really resonated, actually. And yes, when I wrote Playdate, for example, I deliberately chose to make the main child character the same exact age as my daughter at the time. And was that a good thing to do for me personally? Probably not. It was actually really heart-wrenching and difficult to do, but I did it intentionally because I wanted to have very close access to a child that age, and the way they think, the things they might say. But it was hard. But again, in the novel, it's like, it was important to me that there wasn't any kind of gratuitous violence or anything like that towards the kids. Like, I wouldn't be able to work with that. Not then, not now. It's more, the threat that's posed is more on the psychological level. Even though, of course, it is an abduction novel. I wanted to do a take on that was experienced from the child's point of view quite differently to how we might imagine. So, I wouldn't do it again and write a novel with a child protagonist who bears similarities to my own children, actually. It felt close to home.
And it does remind me of, I went from thinking I don't like horror because actually I don't like body horror. I didn't realise, we're talking 20s now, but I didn't realise, newsflash, psychological horror, ghost story, all the gothic novel, all the things that I absolutely adore are horror. I was quite polarised. I didn't realise that my first editor, Linda Rucker, says it's a broad church. But what you've just described, I think it was important to me, that there was a point where I realised what it's actually about is taking that torch, and rather than going, I can't look in that corner, in that dark corner, something bad in my brain, actually shining that light on it and going, what are the questions my mind is asking? What are the stories that are already in there? Was game changing for me. So I can I don't know if it's for the same reasons, but I can kind of relate to taking the bull by the horns, that, you went for something you do have life experience of that is indescribably important to you. And rather than go, I can't look over there, you looked right at it and you went for that what if.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to me.
Yeah. And I had a couple of experiences, like whilst crafting the novel, actually, before I started writing it, my own daughter went on a sleepover with a new girl at school. And I had met the parents, but quite briefly. And again, this is something that readers have said to me and, in reviews, that why would you leave your child with an actual stranger? That's a really big discussion. It's something that I've thought about and answered a lot over the years. And for me, it's also a cultural phenomenon. Like, we were in a very small Scandi bubble. Everybody knew, even if you didn't know somebody personally, you would know their cousin or, their best friend. And so there were some connections that felt safe. But I did, when my daughter went on that sleepover, I did think in the evening, I thought, I had the image in my head that became Playdate, which was, what if when I go to pick her up tomorrow, that beautiful house where I just dropped off PJs and her teddy bear, what if it's just completely empty and it's an Airbnb and she's just gone? And I was like, oh, that image, it was so powerful and it really stuck with me. And it was the starting premise for the book, really. So, yeah.
Yeah, the what if, the fears, that is the stories we are telling ourselves. That is where the gold is.
Yes, absolutely.
It's the truest what if, isn't it? The fear.
Yeah, I think writing fiction is a lot about exploring our own fears or desires or motivations, and then creating characters around that as well. I used to think that I just sit around and make stuff up completely randomly, and it has nothing to do with me or my life. So with my first couple of books, I'd always be like, no, I made everything up. And looking back, I'm like, I was probably very interested in these particular things for a reason and needed to explore that.
And the people watching element of fiction as well. And I was thinking about this actually going back to Charlotte and Bianca. I was thinking about the Wimbledon image. And I say image because for me, domestic noir, for Scandinavian noir, it's all that gap between the image that is projected, or that we're doing this dance where we think everybody else either has these perfect lives or expects these perfect lives, and that dance is happening, and that gap between what is performed and what is real. And in coaching, my job is to narrow that gap, is to make the reality and the performance a true reflection of each other. That's what we're trying to do. That is what authenticity is. And it's created a lot of my favourite fiction. So I guess with those characters, because I can't speak for every human being, but if I were a betting person, you know, it's pretty damn universal that we're very good at looking at social media or, you know, other people's lives and going, look how glamorous that is. I mean, a novelist friend of mine is going to teach and work in Paris. She's living in another village with her family. Like, I could not begin to list to you how many glamorous things this woman is doing. And I happened to tell her that I was going to the Cinema Art Olympic Studios where I sometimes work in southwest London. And the message genuinely was, oh, that's so glamorous because you live in London and you get to do this and then you get to do something else that I wouldn't even register. But there's something about stepping outside and looking at the picture of somebody else that we enjoy it, and then we torture ourselves about it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why the whole, like the gap between the facade and what we see and what is real, it's just endless in terms of inspiration for fiction, right?
Absolutely. Yes, and it's a very good place to explore. We've mentioned writing habits and exercises. Is there any favourite for you, or indeed anything that you'd recommend?
I mean, it's changed a lot for me over the years. Before, it used to be a case of sitting down and getting the word count when I was working on a project, and I would write very much according to inspiration too. So like if I knew that, you know, in chapter 32, this is going to happen, I would just write it right now and then have to go back and piece things together. And I write much more chronologically now, much more to a plan. But it's a loose plan, so I like to have the freedom to be surprised in a draft, for sure. I've tried to not do that and be very, very rigid in terms of having a complete outline. And for me, that took a lot of joy away from the process. It made sense because it was a very plotted, very densely plotted book, and it worked in terms of that. But I actually had to go back over and kind of rewrite everything on a sentence level because it didn't feel free to me in the way that I like to feel free. These days when I'm writing, the only thing that really works for me, especially at the first draft level, is to remove myself from my real life, which again is a big ask. So I tend to go away for 3 or 4 days on a couple of occasions to get the bones in place. And then I can fill in the gaps at home, you know, once a novel is maybe at 25, 30,000 words, that I can do in less than, you know, in like a week in terms of building the word count. But it has to be very intense in that initial phase because you have to see the book as a whole and then go back on the detailed level. That's the thing that works best for me, for sure. And I have tried to just do like every day I work from, 9 to 2. Once I hit like 1:30, I get so stressed that I could break out in hives because I'm like in the flow zone, and in half an hour I have to stop because I need to go and do this, or my son needs to go to the dentist, or whatever it is. And breaking that flow it's excruciating, and I've decided to stop doing it. So I have a lot of days where I don't work at all, even though I could, because I have some time during the day and I could have sat down and written. But I actually don't do it because I know that breaking it would be too difficult at that stage. So it's different for everybody though. And this is what works best for me, is to try to build bigger pockets of taking myself out completely. And then I'll work 16, 17 hours very intensely, like a crazy writer. And then I go back to my normal life and drive the kids and, probably percolate at the back of my head. But yeah, I can't do this job in a sort of 9 to 5 or 9 to 3. I don't want to work like that anymore. I have tried, and no.
And do you find that some days that mental cutoff happens earlier and later than others? Because I do.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. and I don't push it. You know, it's more about having the space to continue if you feel like you can. And quite often I don't work 15-hour days just because I can if I'm away somewhere, or I'll still work a very normal working day and perhaps not get a very impressive word count or whatever, but it's psychologically knowing that I don't have to round off at a certain point. It makes all of the difference. And it makes for a more harmonious author, mom, you know, friend, partner life in general. So it works better.
That's brilliant. I'm going to say back to you what I think I took as a piece of advice earlier and ask you if this is how you see it. One of the many things that is on beginner writers' minds, obviously, is finding those people. And you said very clearly that something the MA was good for, and I absolutely agree with this, is you find other writers, you find people who have the same sort of drives and the need to do it and the fears and all of the things that are going on. And that's brilliant. And you meet some industry people, God willing, through that environment. Acknowledging that you took time out when you had your children, so it wasn't immediate, but in terms of continuing, finding your people, knowing what to apply for, knowing how to continue that momentum, I guess I mean, what would you say to people in terms of, I mean, I'm not sure if it was submission, if you got your agent through submitting, or whether it was a meeting or how you did that, but what would you say to people about that stage of things and finding the right people to help you continue?
I would say at that stage, after the MA, before becoming published and getting an agent, it really was perseverance and not giving up. I mean, I can't tell you how many rejections I had, especially in terms of getting an agent. It was so many, and I worked for years. This was the hardest part of my career, was going from wanting to write, knowing that this is what I'm meant to do, because it's always felt like that for me. And that doesn't mean that it had to, you know, that my career had to look the way it does now, or the way in any particular way, but I knew that I needed a big part of my life to be about writing, and that I was very willing to put in everything it takes to get to that point. And still, if you want to be published, you need people who will read your work and who believe in it. And finding those people was very, very hard for me at the beginning. I tend to compare it to dating. Then it's a numbers game. Okay, so if you go on a few dates and you don't meet somebody you like, it doesn't mean that you're not great. It means that it's not the right person at the right time. And you have to keep putting yourself out there. That's hard in dating, and it's hard in writing too, because like dating, writing is intensely personal on so many levels. It's something you very likely care deeply about, and showing your work to someone and then having them come back and say, no, we don't want this. It sucks. It's hard. And so I developed, I suppose, with time, a pretty thick skin around that. Again, I did have a bit of a drive back then, I think, and I was very determined. And, you know, I would pitch to an agent and they'd come back to me and say, thank you, this is not for us, but, you know, try again another time or whatever. And I actually did go back through my list of rejections. And when I wrote a new project, the one that eventually became my first book, The Boy at the Door, I resent that book to agents that had shown any kind of interest before. Even things like, I do like your writing, however, this is not for us. And so for me, it was a case of, it took a different project at a different time, but it was the same agent who had already turned me down twice before. And when it was the right time and the right book, it was a yes. So I went from having hundreds of rejections, I think, to having 5 out of 5 agents that I sent the first pitch email to, wanting the full manuscript within like a long weekend, and then 3 of them offering representation. And, you know, that happened off the back of, that wasn't like, oh yeah, and then I wrote a book and I sent it off. It took so much targeted work towards the agents and so not giving up.
Not giving up, knowing what you want, targeting.
And believing that whole thing about allowing yourself to want something that much, and believing that, yeah, I can have it.
Absolutely. Such a beautiful note to end on. However, if there is anything I have not asked you that you would like to say to, I mean, it's not just beginner writers. We've got novelists moving into nonfiction. We've got nonfiction doing over here poetry. If there is anything I haven't asked you that you would like to say to them.
I mean, I do on occasion do some writing coaching as well. And I really, really enjoy working with writers who are passionate about writing and who are at the beginning stages of creating a novel, for example. And the thing that I tend to tell them, and which I always want to say to people that want to write, it is that thing about not giving up and that your story matters. And there's always going to be people that don't see what you're trying to do. And I think directing the focus back to yourself and to the page, that's where the relationship is. It's not in, the future when you see yourself on a bookshelf, even though that's a very powerful visualization technique. But I think if you hone the relationship between yourself and the page to the point where you build enough experience and your vision becomes very clear, then all of the other stuff becomes much more attainable because you're getting yourself to the point where nobody's going to turn you down. Do you know what I mean? Like it's maintaining the focus on that. Like, okay, so these people turned you down. It sucks, but go back to the page again and again and again.
Go back to the page again and again and again. Thank you so much, Alex Dahl. It has been a pleasure to have you at the Writers' Gym.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk writing and to see you again after all these years.
You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.